Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Sonic Boom, The Impossible Rise of Warner Brothers Records, from Hendrix to Fleetwood Mac to Madonna to Prince, by Peter Ames Carlin, narrated by David Vries. I'm in love. What's that song? I'm in love with that song. Alex Chilton, Chris Mars, Paul Westerberg, Tommy Stinson. 1. Song Cycle. One recent afternoon, I padded upstairs to my bedroom, dug up some legal weed I had stashed in a drawer, and got stoned. It was just after lunch, usually the most productive part of my workday, and the late summer sun illuminated my midday indulgence in clear, withering light. Back in my basement office 10 minutes later, I donned my fancy Bose headphones, noise-canceling, consciousness-consuming, sonically perfected to some canine ear degree, and crawled under my desk to escape all other stimuli. I had important work to do. I clicked the play button on my iTunes, lay down on the floor, and closed my eyes, preparing to hear, really hear, Van Dyke Parks's 1967 album, Song Cycle, for the first time. Full disclosure, I've owned a copy of Song Cycle for at least 20 years, and have listened to it, or tried to, dozens of times. I had known the record's legend for probably 20 years before I bought it, and had come to admire the music in its grooves even as I found it inscrutable and, how can I put this, an experience that was something other than fun. And I like eccentric art. But Song Cycle threw me off time after time. It requires your full attention and a willingness to open your ears and your mind, cut loose every expectation of popular music you might possess, and let it take you over. So, I went under my desk. No one else was in the house, the lights were dark, and so was my cell phone. Cut off, I willed the modern world away. The Twitter rage, the sanctity of shareholder value, the desiccated dreams, the institutionalized fuckery, the fact that everything is worse than it's ever been. But when has that not been true? In 1967, Van Dyke Parks, a 24-year-old classically trained composer and pianist with his antennae tuned to the avant-most edge of the guard, came to his latest opportunity with wild ambitions. Given a multi-album contract with Warner Brothers Records, or WBR, a deal that came with a big recording budget, creative control, and no deadline, Parks composed songs for an original album that would marry his intricately orchestrated music with Delphic lyrics invoking the dreams and disasters of America's past, while also opening new horizons for musical and spiritual exploration. Like the Beatles' in-progress pop art masterpiece, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and the Beach Boys' unfinished psychedelic symphonic Smile, on which Parks had served as Brian Wilson's collaborator in 1966, Parks's debut album would create its own curiously sparkling world. As Parks and his 25-year-old WBR staff producer Lenny Waronker agreed, they would enter the studio each morning with no guidelines or boundaries. If Parks heard a sound in his head, he and Waronker would work for however long it took using whatever tools they had or could invent to capture it on tape. None of this was normal, not in the popular music business of the mid-1960s anyway. In 1967, when the top 5 singles of the year were in descending order, Lulu's old-school pop hit, To Sir With Love, the Box Tops' straight-rocking The Letter, Bobby Gentry's gothic country ballad Ode to Billy Joe, the Association's romantic Windy, and the Monkees' pop rock I'm a Believer, the vast majority of pop songs could still be recorded from basic track to vocals to overdubs before lunch. But that's not what Parks and Waronker intended to do, and it wasn't what the visionary executive reinventing their record company wanted. After I hit play, I had time for a deep breath before the rising sound of a bluegrass band filled the emptiness. Banjos, strummed guitars, a slide guitar, a string bass, and voices, all clattering through Blackjack Davy, an ancient American folk song about a scallywag who seduces a proper lady into abandoning her family and taking up with him. The rattletrap fades in 50 seconds, revealing a song within another song. This is Vine Street, an original tune Parks commissioned from fellow composer, pianist, and newly signed Warner Brothers artist Randy Newman. The scratchy opening vignette blooms into a string quartet, and the winsome voice of Parks as he describes what we've just heard, a tape of his old band, a folk combo of no repute whose members have long since vanished from his life. Parks's strings leap and tumble, speeding up and slowing down, alluding to 18th century Europe, 19th century ragtime, and the sentimental movie soundtracks of 20th century Hollywood, that Never Never Land where dreams are still born. Or is that stillborn? And here comes more. String sections collide with electronic keyboards, which keep their distance from the Russian violins and balalaikas. Steam locomotives rumble west in one song and then chug eastward through another. There are birds and single-cylinder motors, the dying blast of the Titanic's basso magnifico horn, then a tattered verse of Nearer My God to Thee, artificially Dopplered to portray our movement past the doomed vessel. There are harps, chattering locust percussion, and electronic distortions of Parks's wispy vocals, his words and melodies cloaked in gossamer and subjected to the cardboard tape-yawing device he and Waronker jury-rigged onto the recorder's spindle and dubbed the Farkle. Also, they sped up almost every song. I used to speed up everything, Waronker says. I was taking so much speed back then it just sounded better that way. Parks was just as keen on high-velocity consciousness, and sometimes the fellows would get so pilled up they'd have to run around the block to calm themselves down between takes. But even when they were high, they were not sloppy. Parks was one of the rare hippie musicians who brought unerring discipline to his galactic explorations. His lyrics, multi-entendred musings on life, liberty, and the inevitability of death and failure, are Joycean in their linguistic invention and their farkled perspective of America and the outer limits of physical and metaphysical existence. Song Cycle clocks in at less than 33 minutes, but it's such complicated listening that it can feel like hours. Just try to track the quirky harmonics written into the string charts, or all the colliding time signatures, or the way a steam whistle cry jumps off the horn section's melody in the middle of The All Golden and is then quickly resolved by the horn's next note. Can you tell if the operatic shriek at the start of By the People belongs to a trained soprano or to a theremin wailing through the top of its range? I can't. Then come the church bells and claps of thunder and a fiddle that is part front porch sing-along, part German surrealist horror movie. Strike up the band, brother, hand me another bowl of your soul, Parks and his chorus chirp amid the bells and the light drumming of a rainstorm. We now are near to the end. If you stay with the show, say we all had to go. Later I sat in my backyard blinking in the sunlight. Now it was Song Cycle that had me spinning. The inventiveness, the skirting of the impossible, the farkling of reality by a pair of ambitious youngsters with more daring than common sense. So, what were they doing in the employ of a major American entertainment corporation? To Mo Ostin, then the chief of the Reprise half of Warner Reprise Records, Song Cycle was the living example of the albums he wanted his record label to be producing. This was in 1967, when Ostin was first in the position to put his imprimatur on the record company he'd been managing for nearly a decade. 40 years old and only just beyond the dark suits and skinny striped ties of the mid-century executive, Ostin had neither the look nor the spirit of a radical. He'd come up in the music business through the widely admired jazz label Verve Records in the 1950s, and was tapped by Frank Sinatra to run his about-to-launch boutique label Reprise in 1960. When the singer sold his company to Warner Brothers Pictures tycoon Jack Warner in 1963, Reprise merged with Warner Brothers Records in a new company called Warner Reprise. The conjoined labels ran mostly independently from one another, with Ostin at the fore of Reprise, while WB's Joe Smith performed the same duty at Warner Brothers. The pair of execs came from different backgrounds and had very different personalities. But in the mid-1960s, both had been quick to recognize that society, and particularly popular music, was on the verge of a significant shift. If you were listening in 1966, you could hear it growing, in the increasingly esoteric songs of the Beatles, in the literary nuance of Simon and Garfunkel's lyrics, in the Howlin' Wolf meets Ornette Coleman psychedelia of the Grateful Dead, and so many other glitter-eyed bands lighting up the night in San Francisco. And you heard it not just in the music, but also in all that other 60s business. In the don't trust anyone over 30 stuff, the smash, the statism, the tune-in, turn-on, drop-outedness, the everybody get together and try to love one another right now of it all. The new youth, as music critic and cultural observer Ralph J. Gleason called them, wanted the world, and they wanted it now, and it seemed like a reasonable demand. It wasn't like their parents were doing anything worthwhile with it. In the circle of hip young artists in Los Angeles in the mid-1960s, Van Dyke Parks was always somewhere near the center. Most of the L.A. scenesters, the Roger McGuinns and David Crosbys, the Peter Fondas, and so on, knew him best for being Brian Wilson's collaborator for the Beach Boys' mysteriously shelved psychedelic masterpiece, Smile, and for his contributions to the Byrds and Buffalo Springfield. He had charisma, and could often be found delivering magnetic disquisitions on philosophy, history, and the pursuit of transcendent consciousness. Chicks dug that sort of thing, and Parks dug chicks, none more than his artist wife, Dury. Parks was impish, 5'8" on a good day, with the paisley and tweed look of a stylish Ph.D. candidate. Smart, talented, and handsome, the baby-faced post-collegiate Parks also had a life on him that you would not believe. Born to a psychiatrist and English teacher and raised in Lake Charles, Louisiana, Van Dyke had spent his grade school years developing a crystalline falsetto perfect enough to earn him a slot as a soloist in the American Boy Choir. Attending the group's boarding school in Princeton, New Jersey, Parks paid his tuition by taking jobs in New York City, first as the lead soloist in Arturo Toscanini's 1951 live television production of Giancarlo Menotti's one-act opera, Amal and the Night Visitors. Parks's stage presence earned him a side career in acting, playing a young neighbor on Jackie Gleason's TV sitcom The Honeymooners, and then a child on opera singer Ezio Pinza's short-lived family TV show Bonino. The boy spent a summer in Hollywood performing in The Swan, a costume drama starring Grace Kelly, Alec Guinness, and Louis Jourdain. No one intimidated him. He'd already met and sung Christmas carols in the kitchen of the boy choir's Princeton neighbor Albert Einstein. The genius accompanied the young singers on his fiddle. After a year studying piano, composition, and arranging at Carnegie Tech, now Carnegie Mellon University, Parks dropped out and joined his older brother Carson in a folk duo they called the Steel Town Two. The brothers moved to Los Angeles in 1962 only to break up their act a year later. Set loose in the recording studios and salons frequented by the city's hippest young musicians, actors, and writers, Parks wrote and/or recorded a few clever singles for MGM, including Number 9, a pop interpretation of the central theme in Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, and High Coin, a sparkling tune that describes the heights of his ambition. "I'm going for high coin, baby," he declared. "I'm fine. It's my time." Parks never recorded High Coin himself, but a handful of other artists did, and when he first heard Skip Batten's version on his car radio, Lenny Waronker, a young record producer who had just taken an artists and repertoire, or A&R staff job with Warner Reprise, lurched his car to the curb to listen closely. No kid could have written that song, he thought. But Parks was 2 years younger than Waronker, and when they met, the two musical adventurers became fast friends and recording studio collaborators. On the day in late 1966 when Waronker brought Parks to meet Ostin in the Warner Reprise offices across the street from the movie studio's backlot in Burbank, The erudite artist enraptured the executive like no other musician save Frank Sinatra had ever done. Parks wrote great songs, had a unique voice, and could master any instrument. He could write arrangements for rock bands and orchestras, and he thought like a futurist. Eager to get Parks on board in every conceivable capacity, Ostin engaged him not just as a recording artist, but also as a studio musician, arranger, and producer. Who knew where Parks's brains, talents, and ambitions would take the company next? When the musicians signed the deal on January 5, 1967, Ostin didn't bother hiding his glee. We thought he was a phenomenon. The Song Cycle recording sessions began in the spring and continued for more than 6 months, nearly as much time as it would take the Beatles to record Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and twice as long as it took Brian Wilson to create Pet Sounds for the Beach Boys in 1966. The only reason the Beatles could get away with spending that much time in the studio was because they were the most successful rock band in the world. That an artist with no commercial success would be allowed such a Beatle-size privilege was unheard of, except at the new Warner Reprise, where artists really did come first. Sometimes Parks would book a dozen or more session musicians and hand out fully composed scores for them all to follow. Other times he'd call players in, 1 or 2 at a time, and arrange parts as they went along. Still other times, Parks and Waronker would come in alone so the artist could record keyboard tracks, or the two of them could work with sound engineer Lee Hirschberg to find new ways to enhance or distort the sound of what they'd already recorded. Hirschberg, already a seasoned engineer with credits on records by Frank Sinatra, Lawrence Welk, Sammy Davis Jr., and many others, remembers the Song Cycle sessions as entirely professional. No scarves over the lampshades, no incense burning, and no colored bulbs screwed into the fixtures. Only cigarette smoke in the air and the thrum of group creativity, its pitch elevated just a few cycles by the electrified blood running through Parks's and Waronker's veins. Parks had opted to record for the Warner Brothers record side of the company, and when its managing director Joe Smith came to hear the just-finished album in the fall of 1967, he took in the 33 minutes of musical dream logic and gave Waronker a quizzical look. "Song Cycle, huh?" "Yep." "So, where are the songs?" The former top 40 disc jockey turned promotion man turned company leader couldn't hear the record. Or he heard it, but he couldn't comprehend its place in the pop music galaxy. But Smith could definitely see how much money Waronker and Parks had spent in the studio, somewhere between $75,000 and $85,000, which at that time made Song Cycle the most expensive album in Warner Brothers history. And for all that money, they'd brought him a record that didn't have a single tune Smith could imagine hearing on even the underground radio stations popping up on the scarcely populated FM dial. Smith left the room muttering and shaking his head. Waronker looked over at a red-faced Parks and waved it off with a casual hand. "Don't worry, man." There was no way Song Cycle wasn't going to be released, Waronker insisted. As it turned out, the producer didn't have to say a word to anyone. When Jack Holtzman, founder, president, and chief A&R man of the still independent, folksy-artsy label Elektra Records, came to visit his Burbank colleagues and heard the Song Cycle acetate coming from Smith's office, he sat to hear the whole thing. Afterward, when he heard Smith's grousing about the thing's weirdness, the fucking 80 big ones they'd spent, and the complete absence of commercial outlets willing to promote the thing, he interrupted him with the incredulous response, "You don't want to release that? Shit! I'll put it out tomorrow. What do you want for it?" Smith may not have had the taste for musical adventure that Ostin had just then, but he had the rare capacity to understand that he didn't know everything. He was also aware of Holtzman's magical ears. Less than a year earlier, Holtzman had picked up on the nearly unknown L.A. band The Doors, who had paid him back instantly by becoming one of the top acts in the United States. And as Smith would admit to anyone, including people who hadn't even asked, He was a Jewish kid from a nowheresville suburb of Boston who had gotten lucky in radio and even luckier when he got into the record business. Parks was obviously brilliant. Waronker had his nose to the ground, and between those two and now Holtzman trying to get his beak into it, "Oh no," Smith said. "We're definitely putting it out. That's a Warner Brothers record, for sure." On November 1, 1967, Smith got the song cycle ball rolling with a memo to the company's network of promotion staffers, the local reps who hand-sold Warner Brothers vinyl to record distributors, disc jockeys, record store owners, and anyone else who could push a record into the hearts and minds of cash-carrying citizens. The promo men knew the value of the next big thing, but like all professionals plying a fickle trade, they needed delicate handling, especially when the going got weird. And handle them is exactly what Smith did in his memo. He started with a comic apology for not seeing them more often. "I run around with only the top people now. Any night I can be seen with the Grateful Dead and other nice guys." He ran through some news about Peter, Paul and Mary's new single and coming releases from the Association and Petula Clark before coming to a hard pivot. "In November, we have some strange LPs that will have you wondering if we've all gone on pot and acid out here. However, there are some changes in the business, as you have learned and are learning from Arlo Guthrie and the Grateful Dead and etc., and a lot of things make sense now that wouldn't have a while back." Bracing himself, "We've got this new genius kid, Van Dyke Parks, with the wildest, most overpowering record I've heard in years. It's very, very, very different, and you won't be able to drop it off without some explanation. More on that from us later. But hey, isn't it almost Christmas? Keep going with that good product. It's been a groovy year, and we can wind it up big. Talk to you guys soon." When Waronker played Song Cycle for Mo Ostin, Smith's counterpart down the hall all but ordered a crate of champagne. He was still a Sinatra man at heart. But Ostin, who had signed Parks and then honored his whimsical request to have his music released through the Warner Brothers record side of Warner Reprise, could also hear how special this outlandish music was. Parks's Imagist lyrics had the fractal quality of Pablo Picasso's Cubist portraiture, misshapen eyes peering in two directions at once, mouths smiling and sneering at the same time, a reality distorted to the point of being the truest thing you've ever seen or heard. "We thought we had the next Beatles," Ostin says. He could already anticipate the great reviews Song Cycle would get. It was, he insisted, the perfect album for the recalibrated record company. Artistically ambitious, wholly unique, entirely beautiful. He was sure it would be a smash, but even if it wasn't, that was nearly beside the point. Released in early 1968, Song Cycle hit the small but growing community of serious pop rock critics like a burning bush. To The New Yorker, Parks's creation was a milestone in American pop music, words echoed almost exactly by New York Magazine, who heard a milestone in pop. Time described the album as all shimmering beauty. Jazz and pop went all in, hailing it as the most important, creative, and advanced pop recording since Sgt. Pepper. Esquire included a wink and a nod with its High Album of the Year, but Stereo Review played it completely straight, designating it as nothing short of the Record of the Year. The problem? Hardly anyone wanted to buy the thing. Even after a year, Song Cycle's sales stayed frozen somewhere around 10,000 copies, which would have been disappointing for an album that cost $20,000 or even $15,000 to make. And given Song Cycle's $80K ticket, the situation was, well, problematic. So, what do you do with an $80,000 critical smash that can't find an audience? At Warner Reprise, that's where Stan Cornin came in. A Grammy-winning author of liner notes and a publicity wordsmith going back to Warner Brothers Records' first months in 1958, Cornin had recently been tapped to serve as Warner Reprise's new director of advertising. The fact that he had never before written an advertisement, and in fact viewed the form with contempt, was not just okay with Ostin and Smith, it was what qualified Cornyn for the job. Ads for pop records, to the extent that they existed, had always been dull. Surely any change at all would be an improvement, and the lately fledged ad man did not disappoint. In pursuit of a public voice to reflect Warner Reprise's changing identity, Cornyn created an entirely new style of record advertisement, aimed directly at the educated young record buyers whom Ostin and Smith envisioned as their core audience. Cornyn's first song cycle ad was published on a full page in Rolling Stone and in dozens of the local underground newspapers in early 1969, more than a year after its release. Cornyn divided the page into halves, the top devoted to an enormous headline, which in this case was, "How We Lost $35,509 on the Album of the Year, damn it. Here's what we did. Put out Van Dyke Parks's Song Cycle." Enough said? Hardly. The next dozen paragraphs not only focused on the artist and his music, but also traced the profile of the new Warner Reprise, a funky establishment with nothing to hide and even less corporate jive to hide it in. So, first of all, Cornyn wrote, don't bother feeling bad about the company's financial losses. But there was a dynamic at work. Our Mr. Waronker was the resident genius in charge of the label's tough sell stuff, and he'd spared no expense to produce Song Cycle. The chorus of ecstatic reviews made it clear that the risk had been worth it. But, as Cornyn admitted, not everyone was equally excited, particularly not WBR topper Joe Smith. Our Mr. Smith takes a jaundiced view of art. After about a month of tub-thumping, our Mr. Smith shook his head and said, Van Dyke's album is such a milestone, it's sailing straight into the Smithsonian Institute, completely bypassing the consumer. But the record really was everything the critics said it was, the ad insisted. You shouldn't, honestly, shouldn't miss the album of the year. And one last time, beneath the thumbnail picture of Song Cycle's cover, came the final appeal. It cost us $48,302. Other than the fudged price tag for the album, had any record company, or any kind of company, ever been that transparent about how it did business? And when the gambit didn't work, Cornyn published a follow-up. 2 weeks later, and it still looks black for the album of the year. 2 weeks ago, in this very space, we shoved it to you pretty good about Van Dyke Parks's album of the year that lost us $35,000. Another litany of blurbs followed, and then a delicious new offer. Fans who already had a copy of Song Cycle, and who had undoubtedly worn it out from constant playing, could send it back to Warner Reprise Central in Burbank, and if they included a penny in the envelope, they would receive 2 new copies, one for them and the other for a deserving friend. We don't expect a flood of mail on this one, Cornyn noted. Look, we're already down for $35,000. But if you feel about Parks as we do, send in your old copy and a penny to our Mr. Cornyn. He'll get right back to you. And yet the album refused to budge from the record shop shelves. Parks, meanwhile, was growing increasingly furious. Cornyn, with his ads, was trying to destroy his career. And Smith, for his part, continued to grumble about the Titanic-size hole Song Cycle had left in his annual budget. Meanwhile, Mo Ostin applauded and called for everyone to take a bow. A cheer to Lenny Waronker for his bravura talent scouting and producing, to Parks for his beautiful weave of classical music theory and avant-garde experimentalism, and to good old Stan Cornyn for the sweetly satirical ads that not only celebrated the music and the artist, but also made clear that Warner Reprise would be like no other record company or for-profit American company that ever existed. Who would have guessed where it would all lead, or that any one record company, let alone one that set out to ignore so many of the industry's established practices, could sell so many hundreds of millions of records and rake in so many billions of dollars? And it wouldn't be just a flash in the pan, its success limited to the cultural moment of the late 1960s. Warner Reprise, known eventually as
Sample complete. Ready to continue?